So welcome to this webinar. My name is Alan Fraser. I'm the scientific coordinator of the CORE-MD project from the European Society of Cardiology. And I'll start by sharing my screen just to give a very brief introduction. The CORE-MD project has been investigating methodologies for high-risk medical devices in the European Union for the past 3 years. And our project finishes officially at the end of this month. We held a public conference in Brussels about 10 days ago. And on the left on this slide, you can see the report that we have prepared as a booklet summarizing all the different tasks in our consortium. And that is now available at the library on our website and using the QR code that you can see on the left there if you would like to follow up with more details of all the different tasks. As you will know, perhaps we've also been holding webinars regularly over the past year, and they too are all available to be viewed afterwards. There's a YouTube channel and you can reach them again through our website, and there's a separate QR code there that will take you directly to the page with all the webinars. And they've been interesting and they're informative, and I think they can serve as a good introduction to aspects of the regulatory system for high-risk medical devices in the European Union. One of the webinars at the start the second webinar discussed the origin of regulations in Europe. And I'm just showing one slide from that talk, which you will be able to view if you would like more background, because it explains the basis for what we're discussing today, which is the notified bodies, which for many are a subject that they know little about. But it comes back to legislation passed by the European Community, as it then was, in 1985. And the document was called A New Approach to Technical Harmonization, and it's still sometimes referred to as the New Approach. But what that introduced in several different industrial sectors in Europe was that the manufacturer could prove that their products reached the standards accepted for access to the market throughout the European Union, or the European Community at the time, if they gave the evidence for their device or their product to a special organization, a notified body, which then conducted an inspection called a conformity assessment and issued a certificate to the manufacturer, who was then able to put a CE mark on their device. And the bodies that do this process were national bodies authorized to issue marks or certificates of conformity. They're approved within each member state by an appropriate authority. And once that's been done, the national bodies are notified by each member state to the Commission. And that's where the term notified bodies comes from. But what I stress here is that this was a system designed in the mid-1980s to increase the common market, and it was just a couple of years before the common market moved to the single market, and of course a few years before the start of the European Union rather than the European Community. But when in 1990 medical device directives were first proposed in Europe, the decision was made to use that system, and it's still being followed. We'll hear much more about it today. If you want also to listen to another discussion, there are some podcasts from our consortium, one of them between myself and Rich Holborow, who's one of our speakers today. And you can find that again through the website or through that different QR code, which I'm showing on this slide. Now that brings me to introducing today's discussion, which is about the notified body role for medical devices and the conformity assessment process. And I'm very pleased to welcome three expert, highly qualified speakers to take us through this, each of whom will speak for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion. Rich Holborow is head of clinical compliance, global head of clinical compliance for BSI, and now a very large notified body officially registered in the Netherlands. Suzanne Hallidays is one of the co-chairs of the Notified Body Coordination Group, NBCG-MED, which is the official body with the European Commission of all the notified bodies approved for medical device inspections in the European Union. And lastly, Françoise Schlemmer, who's the director of the Trade Association for Notified Bodies in Europe, which is called Team NB. And they're going to discuss the conformity assessment process, the challenges of the medical device regulation, and some insights from being partners within CoreMD. We will record the webinar. It will become available also. All the participants are in lecture mode, so we would like to try and answer as many questions as possible, but we ask you please to put those in the Q&A box, and we will monitor that during this webinar. If you do need to discuss technical questions, then one of our managerial colleagues is following the chat function as well, but please use the Q&A box if possible for your questions. And so just finally to finish, here are all the collaborators in the CoreMD project, and I highlight bottom right that Team NB has been a very important partner, and we've really appreciated the discussions with them. And now they will get their chance today to tell us more and to share their insights into how the system works. So that's the end of my introduction, and it's now a pleasure to ask Rich Holborow to start, and he's going to describe the conformity assessment process. Richard.
That's great. Thank you, Professor Fraser. And yes, to try and explain the conformity assessment process in 15 to 20 minutes of what is usually a 6 to 12 month process will be tough, but I will do my best. So thank you. Welcome, everybody. So yeah, let's start up with the definition of a notified body. Well, it is actually mentioned in the regulation as to what a notified body is, and that is defined within Article 2 around it's a conformity assessment body designated in accordance with that regulation. So how does it really work? Well, the EU Commission has obviously set the regulation that's been adopted by the member states. And as part of that, we have the member state competent authorities who are also responsible, have responsibilities within the regulation. And that includes supervision of the notified bodies in conjunction with the EU Commission. So we have Commission members as well as member state competent authorities feeding into the role and responsibilities of the notified body. And it's fair to say, we are the middle person in this process because the manufacturer reports to us, particularly for class 2A, 2B, and class 3 devices that are required to have a notified body involved. We, as a notified body, respond to the manufacturer by accepting their applications, etc. But we are the middle person who carries out and ensures that the regulation is followed accordingly with supervision from our member state competent authorities. Couple of clarities and maybe some myth busters is that, notified bodies are not there to look for non-conformance. We are there to look for compliance to the regulation. So when we review manufacturers' technical documentation, we're always looking to make sure that the manufacturer has areas of compliance. We don't provide consultancy services because obviously that would be a conflict of interest, and there's this particular stipulation within the notified body that we cannot be telling manufacturers what they need to do in order to meet the regulation. Okay, it's about us looking at the documentation they provide and to make sure that the regulation, or they're adhering to the aspects of the regulation. And of course, that says, to do that, we have to look for evidence of conformity by ensuring that factual and scientific conclusions are presented by the manufacturer to meet the requirements. What we can't do is make up sort of plug gaps for the manufacturer. So, when we review in technical documentation, it's very difficult for us to when we can see perhaps there is a link, what we're asking for is the manufacturer to always justify and provide evidence of that particular link or where there may be gaps. So we can't make assumptions or justifications. So what activities does the notified body get involved with through the life cycle of a device? Well, there's a pre-market phase and there's a post-market phase. And really, we're involved heavily in the pre-market phase around the assessment of technical documentation. I'll go into more detail as part of this presentation, exactly what we look at, and more specifically within the clinical evaluation. We also perform quality management system audits. So we go on site to the manufacturer to make sure that their processes are appropriate and in place, and again, following the aspects of regulation. For example, to ensure that vigilance episodes or any episodes of the device that lead to serious harm, death, deterioration in health are appropriately being reported to both notified bodies and competent authorities. We're also involved in maintaining competency within our notified body. That's a big part of what we do. You know, a notified body, when you look at it, is a shell of people that are highly qualified and highly skilled. And again, I'll talk about that as part of the presentation today. We also go through designation audits with our competent authorities to make sure that the scope of which we're permitting devices to enter the market is appropriate to us as a notified body. And then there's the post-market phase. So even when we issue a certificate, there's a huge amount of work that goes into post-market surveillance. So things like periodic safety update reports, SSCPs, vigilance reporting. We are constantly monitoring that landscape when the manufacturer's sending us reports on the data of the device. And for some devices, during that certificate cycle, there is permission within the regulation that we look at the data and continue to look at a sample devices through the certificate cycle for lower risk devices. High risk devices always have to have a certificate, a point of application or point of approval. They get a certificate and then they're on the market. But some devices can be groups of devices that maybe we sample 1 of 2 out of a group of 10, and the rest of those devices will be sampled through the certificate lifetime. We also do unannounced audits. So we'll often, go on to manufacturers' premises unannounced, knock on the door and say, surprise, we're here to get onto your manufacturing floor and make sure that you're doing an appropriate job and that you're following your quality procedures, etc. We also have to renew those certificates. And again, I'll talk a little bit about that as part of this process today. And we also do change requests. There is requirements within the legislation that when a manufacturer, particularly to a high-risk device, makes a design change or manufacturing process change, they have to inform us and we have to assess that change as well. And also within the notified body, we're always subject to competent authority audits. They don't just happen once, they're constantly through the process. We also have to maintain what we say is a state-of-the-art competency, so making sure that we are up to date with all the new and informed information as things progress, as incidents occur, etc. We need to make sure that we're fully informed. We also deal with competent authority information requests. So if we certify a product, for example, a competent authority, even though we're designated by the Netherlands in BSI, the French or German competent authorities may make contact for additional information where they may have received concerns about a device. We also have transfer requests, for example, when somebody might want to move from one notified body to another. So how does a notified body become a notified body? How does it become designated? Well, usually that happens, we put in an application and then we are designated by a joint assessment team, which is usually the European Commission with 2 to 3 competent authority member states. And they come in and they inspect us and make sure that all our procedures and processes are appropriate and we're following the letter of the law. They will only designate us as a notified body based on the competence we hold. So that's why you might see some notified bodies with what we call partial scope. So maybe they only have the competency to look at surgical instrumentation. BSI is a full scope notified body. So we have the ability to review all types of medical devices. So that would be your high-risk orthopedic implants, right down to your surgical instrumentations, even to things like microsterilizers or microbiology aspects as well. So we have a full broad spectrum of competence within our notified body. And again, I'll talk a little bit about that. So when we are assessed for our competency, it's not the fact that somebody started last week and they come into the notified body and they're suddenly a notified body personnel. That's not how it happens. There are very strict requirements within the regulation, the competency of who we employ. And that is based upon people's education, working experience, but also their knowledge and understanding of the regulation. When we're audited as a notified body, that's really the heavy focus of what we do is, or what the audit does is to focus on what we as a notified body and the competence we hold. Why is it that I'm allowed to make a decision on a cardiology product? Why is it that my colleagues have that orthopedic experience? Is it sufficient experience to be able to make a decision and allow a device to get to market? So some heavy scrutiny that we receive as notified bodies. So we have to demonstrate, as I said, for all device codes. So that's, as BSI is a full scope notified body, we have to consider our competency for all device codes. That's every type of device, but also there are horizontal codes as well. So when there's devices that incorporate medical substances, we need to demonstrate that we have that pharmacological experience in our staff to be able to make those decisions. Or if there's devices utilizing animal tissues, we need to make sure that the people who are making those decisions and feeding into the process have the competency. So notified bodies went under a huge change. The regulation was the turning point of making sure that the bar for notified bodies was set high, and that was based on some of the issues that we had in Europe historically with devices getting onto the market and some safety concerns. And you've probably all heard about this in the media with different types of devices. And one of those biggest issues was the PIP breast implant scandal, where there was fraudulent activity around the manufacturing process. So the regulation was there now to drive and to make sure that notified bodies are set to a high standard and to a high bar. And I think that's why we often suffer a lot of criticism at the moment, because we've had to step up our bar in terms of the evidence we look for, and really make sure that only safe and effective devices are getting on the market. And for us, that is in the technical documentation that we review. So if you even look at the preamble of the MDR, it talks about things such as the supervision of notified bodies needs to be significantly reinforced. So the competent authorities that designate us are placing more and more pressure on us as notified bodies to make sure that we are setting the bar and we are implementing the new medical device regulation. It talks about the fact that we should be ensuring a high level of health and safety protection and increasing the confidence in the citizens of the system, designing and designation and monitoring of notified bodies by the member states in accordance with detailed and strict criteria. And again, our decisions will be heavily scrutinized by the competent authorities as well and critically evaluated. And the regulation, the preamble of the regulation also calls out that as well. And it says that, if you are a competent authority or member state that is designating a notified body, they are responsible for enforcing the requirements of the regulation. So we get very large amounts of scrutiny from our competent authorities. Now I'm going to show you an example of what's happened with the regulation and who's involved and some of the challenges that we face. So my background is in cardiology with pacemakers and defibrillators. So I thought I would stick with something I know and go for a pacemaker lead. So this was an example where a pacemaker lead, a manufacturer of a pacemaker lead, decided to apply under the regulation. It's a high-risk class 3 device, and rightly so. It goes to the heart and is permanently implanted for usually somewhere between 10 to 20 years for a pacemaker lead. But this particular device had been on the market for 30 years. So it's a standard of care device in the sense that, it's not novel. It has a standard way of being used, and it's a well-known technology, for example. So the manufacturer submitted, what was thousands of pages. You imagine over those 30 years, all the tests and all the data that they've collected on that device, the types of manufacturing processes, the technical descriptions, design test reports, biocompatibility reports, and those were submitted upon the application of the notified body. And that's sometimes the biggest challenge of notified bodies, having to navigate all that complex, aged technical documentation. Alongside that, we've got the fact that we do an on-site audit for the manufacturer. I think one of the challenges of the MDR is that notified bodies, when the regulation was set, was told to consider that new devices come into the market under the regulation are to be considered as if they are new devices, and to make sure that we thoroughly explore all the data, all the test reports, really start from scratch is what we were told, and that's obviously means a lot more work. There was no reliance to lean on to past experience or past engagement with that manufacturer as well, which sometimes gives you an element of trust as well. So who was involved in this assessment from a notified body perspective? Well, we had to have a clinician involved because they have to evaluate the clinical data that was held on the device and determine the benefit risk assessment. We also needed to have a technical expert, so somebody who's experienced in designing these devices and making sure that our standards and specifications were followed. Actually, pacemaker leads have a drug at the end of them called dexamethasone. And actually, we needed a medicinal expert within the notified body to evaluate the drug effects of that. The device arrives sterile to the physician, so we needed to make sure that the sterilization methods used by the manufacturer were appropriate. The MRI lead is now what we call an MRI conditional lead, meaning that the patients with these devices can go into MRI scanners. And again, we needed to have somebody with MRI expertise to confirm that testing. And packaging and transit tests, so these things are manufactured in Europe and need to transport. We need to make sure that the packaging, for example, remains sterile, and an expert was needed there. This is an implantable device, so we needed to make sure that we had biocompatibility experts to make sure that the materials, for example, are not having any problems or concerns, to long-term concerns to the patient. And believe it or not, animal tissues were used in the production of this pacemaker lead. So we needed to make sure that, again, we have animal tissue experts who can do things like make sure that the herd of cattle, for example, have been vetted and appropriately monitored, and that those products are being used in an appropriate way, and there's no leftover derivatives, for example, into the system. And we also have a legal expert, a scheme manager, who brings all this process together at the end to make sure that everything has been concluded and the regulation has been followed. This slide is taken from the guidance that is produced to notified bodies, NBOG 2017-2. It's a very important document to notified bodies because it says you can only employ people in your organization if they meet this minimum criteria. So when we employ into the notified body, we have to follow this specific criteria. The reality is this criteria is probably still very relaxed in terms of who we actually employ. I'll give you an example. If you were to take a medical doctor after medical school after 4 years and expect them to make an assessment on an orthopedic device, for example, that would be very unrealistic that they would be able to have that experience and competency involved, or experience and competency from their previous 4 years of practice to be able to make those decisions. So the reality is notified bodies end up employing senior medical grade officers, and in this example, we had somebody that was greater than 25 years. All those people I showed you on the previous experience, if you were to look at the guidance, it says that you should have a total of 30 years experience if you add all this up. The reality is, as our notified body, in order to make sure we're making the right decisions for these devices, that total was 109 years worth of experience. And when somebody starts a notified body, it usually takes them about 2 years for a notified body personnel to be signed off to work in their role without supervision. So we do also do post-market surveillance. So once we issue the certificate, the journey doesn't end there, and we have to now review these additional documents. So the review of periodic safety update reports, making sure the manufacturer is following their commitment to post-market clinical follow-up, and the validation of the summary safety and clinical performance reports. Technical file surveillance, review of vigilance events. So if a patient is being harmed or injured from a device, that has to be reported to us as a notified body, and we review those to make sure that they're in line with the manufacturer's risk management. And again, competent authority information requests, unannounced audits. And also if a manufacturer chooses to make a change or design change, say for that pacemaker lead, they have to come through us again, and we have to reassess those changes and any evidence supporting those changes. During the conformity assessment process, we do have a series of questions that go back and forth between us and the manufacturer. And also we then have the responses from the manufacturer, which can often take some time because those manufacturers are big institutions, have to go and speak to that particular product expert, that particular design engineer or their clinician to come and bring us responses. So often the review process in a notified body is lengthened because of the time that people take to ask the questions, but also to respond to the questions. And that's sometimes a misconception that notified bodies are slow, but actually it's the manufacturer's responses that often we have to wait for before we can move forward. And sometimes it can be several months before a manufacturer might have to repeat certain tests, for example, to get information to us. So the clinical evaluation assessment really is about the manufacturer requiring to establish, plan and define the objectives under the device under evaluation. And they're required to identify all favorable and unfavorable data and then generate evidence for those gaps. And that feeds into what Annex 14, Part A of the regulation talks about, this establish, identify, appraise, generate, and analyze. All the results analysis then form into the clinical evaluation report. It's often a misconception that the clinical evaluation is a periodic report. The clinical evaluation is actually a process, it's a cyclical process where information is constantly feeding in and the benefit risk assessment needs to be continually revisited. And also information from the post-market surveillance will be considered as well. So these are the key questions that we would ask around a manufacturer's application. Are they state of the art? Have they got an appropriate plan, a clinical evaluation plan? Are they claiming equivalence? Equivalence is a big challenge for us because we have to prove, we have to look to the manufacturer's documentation and verify whether, in fact, the device is truly equivalent biologically, clinically, and technically. And that takes a lot of time to go through the finite details of different materials, patient populations, etc. And that can be quite challenging for us knowing where that threshold exists. So the clinical evaluation plan will set out pretty much what the intention of the device is, covering its intended purpose, its indications, and formulate a clinical development plan as well. And that really is a very important document, the clinical evaluation plan, because it sets out where the device is going to be used and how it's going to be used. And one of the things we look at is state of the art. And really what a question that the notified body is asking is this device better than or equal to what is currently available on the market? And that's what we need to be assured. We are not going to permit inferior products to get onto the market if there's no benefit to patients when there's better alternatives available. So this slide briefly describes what results of the state-of-the-art search and how it happens is that manufacturers will perform a literature search on all the available technologies. So here we have a coronary stent where they've identified risk of thrombosis at 12 months, 6 to 9%, and patency at 5 years of 82 to 86%. The manufacturer then has to set its objectives to prove that that safety objective or thrombosis at 12 months is less than what is currently available on the market, that their performance objectives year patency at 5 years is greater than what is currently available. And that sets the benchmark to what manufacturers need to set as clinical performance objectives. And we talk about other questions about the data that they hold on the device and if clinical investigations have been conducted, including what post-market data might exist on the device. And the definition of the MDR is very clear that it has to be different types of clinical data pertaining to the device under evaluation or the equivalent, I should add here. We're not allowed to use preclinical data, animal testing, bench testing, and nor are we allowed to make assumptions on similar device data. Similar devices do not exist. So when manufacturers often will say to us, our device is similar to this, that's not good enough. We need to have an equivalent or data on the device itself. So these are the types of evidence that is required under the regulation. We also then have to assess the benefit risk and make sure that there's sufficient data covering the conclusions and also verify the manufacturer's post-market clinical follow-up plans. So here, these are all the aspects that we have to consider when thinking about, the manufacturer's benefit risk before we release a device on the market, thinking about things like absorbable materials, anatomical location. All this has to be put together and balanced out to say, well, is there actual benefit over risk for these devices? And benefit risk will vary according to different devices. A basic syringe, for example, will have a lot of benefit, very little risk. But when you move into more complex devices, such as a left ventricular assist device, which is used for patients who are awaiting transplant, they will often have higher risks of things like strokes, etc. But the benefit is they get additional time whilst waiting for a transplant, whereas the alternative could potentially be death. So when we're thinking about benefit risk, it is very much a case-by-case situation, and manufacturers are required to demonstrate benefit risk to us. We then assess, the manufacturer's plans to gather data in the post-market phase, and post-market clinical follow-up is typically there to identify residual risk and to answer any questions that we might not have been able to answer in the pre-market. So my conclusions on this is that, our number one priority as notified bodies is patient safety. Notified bodies are resource intensive. We are based upon the competency that we hold within our notified bodies, and we're audited highly to that. And it's a unique professional skill set with a limited pool of resource to employ from. We are following, as notified bodies, we are following an instruction of the regulation to make sure that only safe and effective devices move forward. And that is forced on us by our designating authorities to make sure that we're following the letter of the law. Notified bodies have increased their assessment times and depth of assessment because there's more to explore, and in some cases we've had to start again as part of the regulation. And it's important to remember that cost to manufacturers is coming from the regulation itself and the need things like to collect clinical data for evidence-based medicine, the cost of additional documentation, the cost of additional audits throughout the certificate cycle, the additional things like PSUR and SSCPs, for example, which weren't there under the directives. And notified body fees are probably a part of the larger regulation cost, but I'm sure we'll cover that as part of this. ultimately, I am proud of the new regulation. I think it is improving patient safety and transparency of what we do and what everyone does for patients in Europe. And I think it is driving an evidence-based medicine culture, and that's something we should all be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rich. And you've given a nice, clear, comprehensive overview of all the activities that are involved in a conformity assessment. While you're stopping sharing your screen, let me just ask you one brief question. I think I understand that as one of the largest notified bodies, you have perhaps more than 1,000 people employed doing inspections of medical devices. And they're not all full-time employees. Many are clinicians outside the notified body who work part-time. And I think that model is followed by lots of notified bodies. So there are lots of people in the system, but you've described what you would do to analyze a device. How sure are you that what you do is the same as what everyone else will do?
It's a very great question. And when we're working in silos, it can be difficult to collaborate. But some of the things that we have been doing through Team MB, for example, is the Clinical Experts Forum. And we learn from each other about what is a sufficient level of evidence. So it's all about networking and speaking with other notified bodies, which Team MB enables us to do. But yeah, it is difficult. We are still in the learning phase. Let's not forget it's 3 years in. But yeah,
it's one of the comments that's been made about the European system, and I think your answer tells us that you can't be absolutely sure, but you're trying to minimize the variability. But we'll come back to that in the general discussion. I'd like to move on, and Suzanne Halliday is already sharing her screen. Susie, thank you for joining us. And I think you're going to give another perspective on the medical device regulation.
So yes, thank you. Is my screen showing? And can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the nice introduction and the invitation today to join this webinar. I am going to do a few interesting headlines from the newspapers. I'm going to talk a bit about the expectations and the notified body's perspective on the implementation. And then I will end with a little bit of positive transparency and predictability. And so again, as I said, I clipped some headlines out of the newspapers. MP attacks dodgy auditing and conflicts of interest. Could be a medical devices headline. However, this is one from 2008, and it's actually related to the financial industry and the auditors that may have been too close to the financial institutions that then went bankrupt and almost took down the whole entire financial system globally. Another one, monitoring of safety practices and ethics needed. Could be the medical devices industry, but again, this is from 2010 when Deepwater Horizon leaked oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And the root cause analysis showed that there were many different participants and auditors that missed things and test reports that were not complete. And again, so petrochemical industry. Flawed analysis and failed oversight. Could be medical devices. However, 2019, this is the aviation industry. And this is when Boeing made 737 MAX, set the engines too far back on the wings, developed some software to force the nose down. Again, the criticisms in the newspapers, I'm not an auditor for all of these other industries, but showed that it had got so technical that Boeing started to delegate some of the assessment, the FAA started to delegate some of the assessment to Boeing itself. So it wasn't a third-party conformity assessment. It was assessment by selves, and it missed some things. My fourth one, production paused over safety scandal. Again, not medical devices, coming just to last year when Toyota bought Daihatsu, and Daihatsu had falsified some of their collision tests, and Toyota has now paused production so that they don't lose their reputation, because they would really like to know if their collision tests are showing that their cars are safe. And just one more from the newspapers. Regulation is slowing down innovation. Again, not the medical device industry, but the marine industry. And I'm sure you're all aware that last year, an experimental submarine went very, very deep into the ocean and imploded and killed all of the people that were on the sub at the time. So I will come back to the medical device industry. Medical devices are one of the heavily regulated products that are out there, as with aviation and cars and petrochemicals and so on. And so when the MDR and IVDR were in their final draft, DG Sante director called the notified bodies and the competent authorities and manufacturers in and said, look, we've got draft text. We think it's going to respond to the medical device scandals related to breast implants and gynecological meshes and metal-on-metal hip joint replacements. We think it's, bringing the legislation up to date, because the MDD and AIMDD were written in the 1990s, and the proliferation of software since then was exponential. There were novel chemical entities. There was more use of medical devices by lay people in people's homes rather than professional use settings by professionals with medical training. And when the MDD and AIMDD were written, there were 12 member states. And now there are more than twice that many member states. So there is some divergence. And I think, as Rich said, the MDD has some big expectations, and we are trying to do some changes. On the same day that we saw the draft text of the last text of the legislation, Salvatore Dal Cunto gave us some more details that the new words should better protect public health and patient safety, should provide some legal certainty, should allow more transparency and patient empowerment, and allow for a more European approach. And his presentation, you will get these slides, so you'll see he went on and he talked about a number of things that were going to happen pre-market and post-market. And so I've taken his words and shown you. For the first time ever, the notified bodies are now working on products that have no medical purpose, like contact lenses, brain-stimulating products, implants that are not necessarily for handicap or disability, but are for more cosmetic reasons. For the first time ever, notified bodies are looking at reusable surgical instruments. We are looking at custom-made implants for the first time. And in many cases, MDR up-classified products. As Rich showed, as the class of a product goes up, there is more conformity assessment from the notified bodies. So all meshes were up-classified. In vitro fertilization media was up-classified. Spinal implants have been up-classified. Fingers and wrists and toe joints have been up-classified, and software in many cases has been up-classified. In addition, on the pre-market side, conformity assessment also now comes from some expert panels. On the post-market side, we are, EUDAMED, I guess, registration will allow more transparency of all the devices that are on the market. It will allow us to look at which notified bodies are designated to do which types of conformity assessment. UDI will allow us to see exactly what device is on an incident report. It allows us to do more thorough comparisons of what is on the market and what might be coming to the market, because we're sure of what devices we're talking about. Implant cards allow patients, we can track implants right to the patient that got them. This didn't happen for all European countries. It happened for many other countries around the world, but not Europeans. Safety reporting for death or serious deterioration in the state of health has come down to no greater than 15 days. This is the most strict in any of the countries that I have ever audited for. And the PSUR is another check of safety signals in light of state-of-the-art and other competitor products and other ways of treating a particular disease. And the SSCP, which is the summary of safety and clinical performance, it gets written to the professionals, it gets written to the lay people, so that they can make choices for themselves or their family members. So lots and lots of good things coming because of MDR. And no legislation will ever help us to be sure that we are 100% certain of something before it goes to market. But this is a really good balance of checking pre-market, going to market, and then following up in the post-market phase. So from the notified body point of view, the MDR text, entered into force in 2017, had an original date of application in 2020, and the directive certificates are all void as of this May. And there was some core agenda to fix some errors, but we had to admit during the pandemic that we needed to push the date of application out. But we didn't push out this other deadline, and so it compressed the transition period into a much shorter time than was actually feasible. Because in the extra year that we were given, manufacturers chose to keep doing changes to MDD certificates instead of getting on with MDR transition. So the notified bodies have really only been focusing on MDR transition since about May 2021. Not all manufacturers, but many. We didn't start to focus until May 2021. It wasn't until last year that we actually pushed out the end of the transition date until, the first day of 2029. And it is a big effort. In the transition period, the notified bodies had to rewrite all our procedures, requalify all of our employees, get designated, which was at least a 12-month period. The fastest member state finished in 12 months. Some notified bodies, it's taking up to 3 years to get designated. But we had to be designated before we could even start to take on applications from manufacturers. And this is the only change I have ever known that is 100% complete re-review of everything that is on the market. So let's look at, as I said, I have been doing conformity assessment within a notified body for more than 20 years. And the European MDR and IVDR are definitely the biggest changes, bigger than any of the standards changes, bigger than us getting designated in the past after the PIP breast implant scandal, bigger than having to do unannounced audits of all manufacturers for the first time, bigger than the MD-SAP change for Canada and the US, Brazil, Japan, and Australia. And of course, there have been a few other hiccups with the UK leaving and Switzerland not signing mutual recognition agreements. If I zoom in on some changes that are specific to the EU, on the vertical axis are the number of pages of NBCG guidance, and along the horizontal axis are the number of years. 1,400 pages of guidance and templates and specific details that need to be followed have been published since the MDR entered into force. So it is a challenge. Everything is changing, and change is good, but changing everything all at once is a real challenge. But we are getting on top of it, and things are improving. There are more changes coming, and I think the notified body plea to the EU is, let's make sure that competent people are in the room when we're discussing what conformity assessment is and what the changes are, and let's not duplicate what someone else is doing. Because now I've moved MDR and IVDR up to the top, and we know that corporate sustainability reporting is coming, health technology assessment is coming, battery regulation is coming, information security is coming, machinery regulation is coming for those of you that have moving parts, AI regulation was approved last week for those of you that have AI, there is European health data space coming, and the pharmaceutical legislation is changing. And of course, throughout that time, as state-of-the-art moves on, the REACH regulation changes our opinion of the phthalates or PFAS or microplastics or the use of ETO that is acceptable for patients in the EU. I am going to finish by saying some positive things. I'm sure you're aware that the notified bodies are responding to a lot of surveys. There is now a link on this slide that will show you the progress of the notified bodies' applications and certificates. It is called the dashboard. Sometimes you'll see it published as PowerPoint slides. Sometimes you'll see it in a live dashboard form. But I wanted to show you some progress over time because I have been taking some snapshots approximately every 6 months. So applications for MDR are exponentially increasing. You know, I know that the dashboard will tell you that there's supposed to be about 25,000 certificates out there for the EU. Who knows if that's the correct number? But if it is the correct number, then we've got approximately 72% of the applications now. Again, the number of certificates that have been issued is also growing exponentially. 22% as of last October, 22% of the certificates needed had been issued. And this is good progress, considering that, you know, in my first 6 months snapshots, you know, there were 14 notified bodies, then 19, then 24, and then up to 38. And again, remember that the notified bodies really started to focus on doing MDR work when we could stop doing MDD work, which was May 2021. We think that the dashboard also shows that you know, what is submitted to the notified bodies, it's hard to interpret some of these. So look at my little gray bubbles. It looks like 58% of the notified bodies said that less than 50% of their applications were complete. And then it got even worse and even worse. But if you look at the latest data, it's starting to improve again. So in general, we think that these data show that the manufacturers still need some help interpreting all of the new requirements. There are new notified bodies, there are new manufacturers, and there are new requirements for us all. We are working on more consensus documents, but at the moment, there is a, you know, 2023-607 has taken us some effort to implement. We are now doing appropriate surveillance of expired certificates. Our IT teams hate us. Why are you auditing the expired certificates? And we have to deal with this until the first day of 2029. Predictability, so this is again from the dashboard. The way that the Commission asked the questions of the notified bodies, the first time we answered questions, we could show that 33% of our applications had been completed in a 12-month period of time. Then they started to ask us the question slightly differently, and we answered differently for the lower risk products that only needed an Annex 9 Chapter 1 or an 11 Part A certificate than from the higher risk products that needed a product-specific certificate. So 54% of the applications could be completed in 12 months for lower risk products. And unfortunately, at the time, none of the higher risk products were completed in less than 12 months. It is improving. It has gone up to 63% for the lower risk products and up to 24% for the higher risk products. And the latest snapshot that you can see live on the Commission site shows, again, similar numbers. So in general, we think that what's happening is that the notified bodies are gaining experience, the manufacturers are gaining experience. There is an increase in confidence in everybody once you get used to doing it once, and it will result in decreasing timelines because we know that we need to get faster than a 12-month turnaround time. So that's it for me, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Susie. And I think in the interests of trying to preserve our discussion time, I'd like to move straight on. There are a lot of attendees, a lot of participants, and a lot of questions. So may I please introduce Françoise Schlemmer, who's the director of Team NB, and you're going to give us some further reflections on the process that we've started with CoreMD. I think, Françoise, please go ahead and share your screen. And we can see the slides. It's all yours.
Okay. Thank you for this invitation. Sorry, it looks that I have begun too quickly. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Alan, and thank you for the invitation. As you can see, Team NB is representing more than 30 notified bodies. We have, today we have even 43 members, some of them still in the process to be designated, 5 of them, the other has been designated. The role of Team NB is, of course, to communicate with all the stakeholders, but also to improve technical and ethical standards. And today, more than before, we are working in collaboration with the authorities to try to improve the guidance, make them more practicable, and trying to harmonize notified body members' practices. We have been founded in 2001, and you see that in 2012 we put in place a code of conduct following which peer review took place. That was the aim of this was to prepare members to reach more easily the designation against MDR and to prepare them. And for that, we are working on that document on a regularly basis, and we have the version 5, which is in progress to help the member to adapt to the coming modification. As I told you, it has to be always have been the aim of Team NB to help the members, and one of them was to help them to be designated. And you can see that for both MDR and IVDR, a big part of the notified body designated are members of Team NB. Team NB have a lot of actions in this aim. One of them is to have a mirror group to the NBCG working groups, the 11 to which observers are authorized. And we are preparing the meeting, of course, participating to them, and distribute to all members the report for the participation to this meeting. We are also commenting on the guidances that are proposed for publication, and we are involved more than before in the writing of document, which is an help to have them as practical as possible. We have also set up task forces. We have more than 20 of them to address specific topics, and also have an objective of harmonization. With on some of this issue, we issue position papers which are published on the Team NB website to have the other stakeholders be informed of what have been decided. We have also mirror groups in line with EMA. Okay. We have also done actions to help the other stakeholders with trainings, as first of all, trainings among all the auditors of the notified body, mainly the members, but also allowed to non-notified body members. We, as Richard told you, have set up expert session, which a name of allowing senior expert to share their experience and tackle difficult topics and cascade the info to all the reviewer within their organization. You probably know about the initiative of Team NB to do 2 different trainings, one for technical documentation against MDR and the other for technical documentation against IVDR. In both cases, a part of them is a presentation of a best practice guide which has been established by a compilation of all requests and of different notified bodies, and after that a compilation to try to have something that is working as much as possible to harmonize the requirements. As far as CoreMD work is concerned, we have been welcome at the latest stage in that very interesting project. And at the end of the day, we have been involved in all the work packages. The expert involved have been from different notified body, as you can see. And we have been welcome as participants, and I think that have allowed a better understanding between clinicians from academy and from hospitals to know more about the things has to be taken in consideration by clinical expert taking part from notified bodies as learned interaction and clinical association. And we have also, I think, put forward that the clinician within the notified body are trained and rigorously and continuously according to the requirement. We have reviewed within the CoreMD work following the improvement of the relationship, as I show you. Also, we have allowed to share the knowledge and come to a few documents that we hope could be in a second step considered as at the authorities level. And thanks to that work, we have addressed such difficult work on SSCP, and also we have considered possibilities on some information to be put on UDAMED as soon as it will be available. We have also tackled information on certificate under condition, with the opportunity to consider that possibility, especially for innovative medical device and orphan devices. All that work have led to a lot of recommendation, and as I told you, we hope that some of the documents we have worked within CoreMD will help to improve the system and could be adopted in the next years, knowing, of course, that probably that will be made at different stages. As far as for the time being, all the resources are very under pressure for at the different within the different stakeholders. We hope also to produce tool that will be that will have increase the patient safety and also the transparency of the system. And we think that innovation is really something we need to consider for the future of the European market. We also hope to have some points considered as part of trainings, which we are doing today, and or information as we are doing today, and more in-depth training for the future, but also for education. And we hope that, as we say, we will be able to help to fulfill the market needs and study all the programs that we could help to have the resource trained resource available for all the stakeholders. We expect also a lot of better understanding in the future towards the information that will be needed, and it is really the aim of notified body to focus on safety and effectiveness for improving public health. We never have to forget that all of us are one day or later a patient. Thank you very much for that. And I hope that I will give back the floor to Alan.
Thank you, Françoise. And I think between you, we've heard a lot about how notified bodies work, about the challenges of the medical device regulation, and also, and I second your points, Françoise, that it's been very helpful for us as clinical academics and medical associations in Europe to start to get to know better what notified bodies do and to meet clinicians who work within notified bodies. And such exchanges can only be positive in the future. Now, we have about 15 minutes. We've had a lot of questions, and you've been busy answering many of them online before I've even had the chance to read all of them. But there are comments coming up that I think we could have predicted. Let me start with the issue of transparency. Notified bodies have tended to be viewed as a black box, if you like. We don't know who's in them, we don't know what they do, and they can't tell us what they do. If I give the example, in the past, I've tried to understand the opinion of a notified body because I thought it was clinically dangerous. I contacted the notified body through my regulatory agency in my own country, but got no information back. So are you able to explain your decisions to clinicians or healthcare professionals if they want to understand why a device is on the market? Because within CoreMD, we've found that devices come onto the market very often before evidence has been published in the scientific literature. So who would like to take that question first? Richard.
Yeah, no, thank you. So you can imagine with notified bodies, there is a level of commercial sensitivity with the manufacturers and then business sensitivity. So that lies between us. But the mechanism that happens in Europe related to post-market surveillance was, for example, when you report that to a competent authority, they will then get in touch with us as a notified body and ask us to do an analysis and review. We may request technical documentation from the manufacturer to revisit it. We always then have to, and legally bound to, provide a response to that competent authority. What we can't do, or what the regulation doesn't allow us to do, is to talk publicly about that. I think some of the things that are happening now in the new regulations, such as the transparency aspects around summary of safety and clinical performance, where a manufacturer is now required to submit the clinical data they hold on the device, particularly high-risk devices, I should say, to be made publicly available, and that will provide information to healthcare professionals and practitioners. We are awaiting NBCG-MED as well, and NBCG-MED will be the key tool in being able to have an overview of vigilance and analysis of what's going on.
And that will be the European database on medical devices. I'm conscious that there have been a lot of acronyms in the presentation this afternoon, and not everyone will have understood all of them. But let me ask a second question about transparency. How does a manufacturer or a clinician understand what expertise exists within a notified body? Because we can't imagine that all the notified bodies have similar access to similar numbers of specialists in each field at the same level. So, Susie, perhaps you can tell me, why can't you advertise or explain how many clinicians you have within a particular field?
Okay, Alan. I think that the NANDO designation is public, and that should show exactly what a notified body is competent to do, or if they have any exclusions. If you look carefully at some of the notified body designations, it will say excluding breast implants for soft tissue. But I can answer specifically for BSI. We do have some indications on our website of who our employees are and how much experience they have. maybe it's one we take away and try to harmonize across the notified bodies.
So that's a voluntary thing that you can do, or that notified bodies can do at the moment.
Yes.
But part of the questions that I get asked as a clinician who attends regulatory meetings in Europe is, if somebody comes to Europe and they want to know where to go to get an opinion or to get a particular device approved, there should be some way to find out where the expertise lies. Now, Rich, you mentioned these clinical expert groups, and this is a method I think that you've started to try and produce some predictability of decisions for similar evidence presented to different notified bodies. How is that developing? Would you like to answer that? Or, and again, we have little time, so short answers, please. I'll try and keep my questions short as well.
Yeah, certainly. The regulation says, that notified bodies shall ensure that the manufacturer has sufficient clinical evidence. Well, what is sufficient in the context? So we've set up these meetings, to have discussions with different clinical experts. So when we have an orthopedic implant, what are we expecting when a manufacturer brings a brand new device to market? What are we expecting if it's one transitioning from the directives to the regulations? What are we expecting in terms of evidence if they're claiming equivalence? We have those discussions, because for us as notified bodies, it's important that we calibrate, because we do hear the conversations. What always surprises me, and I'm going to say something controversial, is often we are very much calibrated in those meetings when we talk about those expectations. And I think there is a bit of game playing that happens in the background of, you are too tough, and so and so notified body says that it will accept less evidence. But actually the reality is, when we do have these discussions, we do have a good playing level field of what is sufficient clinical data.
Thank you. So you are starting to work together as clinical experts within different notified bodies. And I would hope in future that there will be collaborations on a broader field as well. But we'll have to see how the review of the medical device regulation takes that. May I ask also about this issue of predictability and getting early dialogue and advice, because the Commission in the medical device regulation said that you couldn't give advice in advance, but they have now come up with the statement that a dialogue of some sort is possible. And we also know that the European Medicines Agency, through the expert panels, now has a pilot scheme for giving advice to developers of new devices about what clinical evidence will be available. And that's part of the answer to the question that was raised in the Q&A. So where are we going with this, and how are we going to develop the ability of manufacturers to give you complete applications and not all this missing data that we've heard that you're currently being offered? Susie, do you want to start that? How do we deal with this issue?
Yes, so I'll start. I think the 2022-14 talks about structured dialogue, and
that's a European Commission guidance document that you're referring to.
Yes, thanks, Alan. You're right. One of the suggestions is that the notified bodies shall conduct structured dialogue. And we have listened to some suggestions from some of the manufacturers' associations. Now, some of the things that they'd like to ask about are very easy for us to harmonize on and make consensus, a consensus application document, a consensus technical documentation document that all of the members can agree to. How are we going to conduct audits in a remote manner? And those are things that we are working on. There are some more challenging ones, like, is this an equivalent product? Could you agree that this is equivalent? Then I don't need to do an investigation. And that's the more challenging one. And you have to have entered into a contract with a particular notified body before it gets really easy for us to start to have those types of really detailed discussions. Maybe I'll let Rich also jump on that one.
Yeah, I'll just add that, to get predictability in the European space, we need to make sure that the people who are making the decisions are offering advice, and not offering advice, but certainly involved in the preclinical strategy, so that they can say, well, these are our expectations. It's all good, other agencies offering the advice, but if they're not making the certificate decision, that's still a risk to the manufacturer. So we need to look at this. And for me, consultancy is about me telling somebody what to do. When it becomes unfair is when I mark my own homework. So there are things that notified bodies with member state competent authorities could do that we could make sure actually we can provide scientific advice in a isolated field, make sure that anyone who provides that advice is not involved in the conformity assessment. And we hear these comments of innovation is leaving Europe, and to bring that predictability is going to require a review of what we offer in Europe, because the regulation at the moment is not allowing us. Annex 7 1.2.3 is very clear that notified bodies cannot engage in consultancy services. So we need to think about this, and we need a multi-partnership approach.
I think it's reasonable to inform colleagues that there are two specialist working parties or task forces of regulators in Europe at the moment that are addressing two of the particular challenges that we see. One is for the approval of orphan medical devices, hopefully to produce recommendations for, if not an alternative pathway, at least special recommendations for how they can be viewed favourably. And secondly, for using conditions on certificates, because the European system doesn't have the process of conditional approval, at least not legally, but you as notified bodies are able to issue certificates with restrictions or conditions to collect more data or for limiting the indications and so on. But within CoreMD, we found that you're only using that perhaps 1% of the time for high-risk medical devices, so it's not working at the moment. How do you see that changing? And again, this may be something for you, Rich, perhaps first, or Susie, who would like to take that?
I'll jump on that one, Susie, if you don't mind.
We've got just a few minutes left.
Okay, so the regulation now talks about specific limitations and restrictions. We see the use of certificates with conditions to support innovation. It's important that when we have new innovative novel products, that we have a limited market release. There is always the unknown unknowns, and that is always a risk for notified bodies when we certify devices. But we need the network of registries and the support that goes with that to make sure that we can roll out these products to patients in a safe and effective manner. Notified bodies, as part of Team MB, have had these discussions and are very much engaged in ensuring that, in certain situations, yes, let's use certificates with conditions to support innovation and orphan devices. Susie.
There are a huge number of questions. I think, if you'll allow me, and please interrupt if I'm saying anything wrong, I'm going to deal with some of these very quickly. Because I'm the chair of the Regulatory Affairs Committee of the Biomedical Alliance, I think I know the answers to some of these, but we've just been talking about structured dialogues and conditions on certificates, and there is a difference here between the European Union and the FDA, but there are discussions about how the European system can change in future, and about the fact that there should be similar regulatory provisions and requirements in different jurisdictions, so that there shouldn't be competition for new types of high-risk devices and where they're evaluated. CoreMD has no official links with the experts panel. They're appointed independently by the European Medicines Agency to advise on medical device applications and conformity assessments through the clinical evaluation assessment report that the notified bodies produce. And a certificate of conformity assessment certificate is what the notified body delivers, and then the manufacturer puts a CE mark on their device. I think that's the correct way that it happens. It's often called CE marking or a CE certificate, but would anyone like to deal with that legal point, just to clarify the question?
The declaration of... Oh, go on, Susie, you go first. You're more experienced.
Yeah, well, no. Yeah, I think, Alan, you said it. The manufacturer makes a declaration of conformity that they meet the requirements. It's European law. And then notified bodies, our only role is third-party conformity assessment. We assess whether there's sufficient evidence and agree that the declaration has been signed correctly. We issue a certificate if we agree.
Yep. There's a question now on what will happen if the notified bodies and the expert panels have different opinions in evaluating a high-risk medical device. How do you see that being resolved in future?
So if that's in the context of after our assessment, then there is steps within the regulation that talks about we as a notified body have to justify, and that that justification is made public on the EU Commission website as to why we've disagreed with the expert panels and we've chosen to certify. If we choose not to certify based on the expert panel opinion, we would not need a justification and the product wouldn't get to market.
There's a question about guidance on conducting clinical investigations, and here we can highlight that the European Commission is currently revising its recommendations on clinical evaluation for high-risk medical devices, and there's likely to be a document for public consultation quite soon this year in 2024. I think I've covered many of the points, but I'm sorry we're not going to be able to cover all the questions in the Q&A. We can take note of these, and Jean-Baptiste, who's with us, see if we can answer any of them offline afterwards. But I'd like to thank you, Jean-Baptiste, and EFORT, the European Federation of Orthopaedics and Traumatology, for coordinating our Core MD webinars expertly over many months now. And may I go around the participants today for your final comments? How are we going to improve the public perception of notified bodies? And I'll leave the most difficult question to last. How can we reduce the cost of the process? You are independent commercial organizations. Some of you are for-profit organizations, others are not. But one of the main arguments that I hear from many people is that the legislation which you've supported today is now much more complex, and it is costing manufacturers much more time and money than perhaps is reasonable for some low-risk or rarely used devices where the economics just don't add up. Françoise,
Will I start?
Susie, you may start. And a brief reply, and then we'll stop.
Of course.
Thank you.
So MDCG Guidance 2023 number 2 is a template where the notified bodies can make their fees transparent to everybody in the similar format. I think that we are encouraging all notified bodies to use the template, which includes, Alan, a column where there's a range of what the fees will be. So I think transparency is the first step. And as I said in my presentation, we think the fees are on their way down as everyone gains confidence in what the requirements are and what you need to do to meet them.
That's important news, and I think it's fair to say that that system's not working completely at the moment. So if you are able as notified bodies to encourage everyone to be transparent about fees, that would certainly be a start, I think. Rich or Françoise, do you want to add anything? I don't want to get this wrong. You know, but I don't.
I'll jump in to say that I think transparency is happening through notified bodies, through the work and partnership that we've done with CoreMD and other initiatives that will follow in due course. The second point I would say is that regarding costs, we need as all stakeholders to build the infrastructure and the ecosystem in Europe to make evidence gathering part of clinical practice. And that requires input from the European Commission, input from member states, input from medical professionals, patients, and notified bodies. If we get that infrastructure right, then Europe suddenly becomes an attraction for innovation and evidence generation. That's all I'll say.
And Françoise,
yeah, just to notice that we have now 44 notified body designated against MDR, but some of them are just very recently designated, and those are definitely still in the learning phase, and it will surely improve the cost when the learning phase will be ended. And it is fair to say that as well for the manufacturer side, the knowledge they will gain on how to fulfill the requirement will surely help to decrease the prices.
Thank you. I think it's also worth informing people that the European Commission has recently provided some administrative managerial support to your committee, Susie, NBCG-MED, so they recognize the need for increasing coordination and providing training and dealing with all these problems that we've been discussing today.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And we greatly appreciate that support. I mean, we have never had that. And yeah, it is a great aid to some harmonization.
And I think you will also agree that there is likely to be further evolution of the way the notified bodies work, but that will be for another day. Thank you all for your contributions. Thank you, if you've been listening, for participating in this webinar. And as I've said already, please look at the other webinars in the series at our website if you haven't done that before. Thank you, everyone.